Hello everyone, welcome to my talk. I am Shayuk Shahroy, a PhD student at the University of Texas at Arlington. Today I would like to present my work on characterizing sparsely detected malicious URLs on Twitter. This work has been done in joint collaboration with Uni Karanjit and my supervisor, Dr. Nilizadeh. Phishing websites are social engineering attacks which imitate the look of a legitimate organization. Their sole purpose is to steal your personal data. For example, the website given here resembles an Amazon.com login page and it wants to trick potential victims into sharing their login information. On the other hand, drive-by downloads lure their victims by promising free access to some software. For example, this website tricks you into downloading the TrickBot Trojan instead of the Fortnite installer that it seemingly appears to offer. These attacks can be found anywhere on the web, but they're most prominent across social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, etc. In fact, 86% of organizations reported malicious attacks that originated from social media websites. Now, to counter these attacks, most of these platforms have their own content blockers. However, the ease at which users are frequently getting exposed to these attacks while using social media websites kind of hints to the fact that several threats might still be getting undetected. In this work, we are focused on finding how and why malicious URLs might be going undetected on Twitter. Now, let us quickly overview the framework that we have used in this study. We started by collecting over 3 million tweets using the Twitter API over the period of a year. From these tweets, we were able to extract more than 132,000 unique URLs. We then identify which of these URLs are malicious in nature. We keep posting them regularly on Twitter to see how it reacts to them. So we basically get two types of URLs in our study, the ones which are detected by Twitter and the ones which are not detected by Twitter. Both of these URLs are then scanned using traditional anti-phishing tools to compare the performance of between the detected and the undetected URLs. Finally, we evaluate the undetected URLs to identify their characteristics and features. To find the malicious URLs in our dataset, we scan them using VirusTotal. VirusTotal is an online tool which aggregates the detections of 80 different anti-phishing engines into a single score. A typical VirusTotal scan report for a URL shows both the total number of detections as well as the name of the tools which detected the URL. We label a URL as malicious when it is detected by at least one engine on VirusTotal. In this way, we found a total of 4,500 URLs which had at least one detection. But we cannot label our URLs as malicious based on the VirusTotal report alone. And I will actually discuss why in the next slide. Previous work has found that VirusTotal is sometimes inconsistent. They often use detection labels which lag behind the anti-phishing tool detections by several hours. Thus, our data, solely relying on VirusTotal would probably make our data set be affected by incorrect labels. Thus, to maintain the consistency of the detection labels, we manually investigated all of these 4,500 URLs. We classified the URLs into 4 categories: phishing, drive-by downloads, benign, and unknown. Unknown websites are basically those which did not show any malicious behavior, but we also could not confidently say that they were actually safe. Thus, we decided not to include these unknown URLs in any further analysis. We found a large portion of the URLs which were detected as malicious by VirusTotal to be actually benign in nature. Though not the main focus of our work here. We explore Twitter's reaction to these benign URLs briefly towards the end of this presentation. In total, we found 950 phishing URLs in our dataset. Trying to trace these URLs on Twitter, we observed that the tweets were either unavailable, which probably suggests that Twitter had removed them, or visiting them displayed a warning that the website is unsafe to visit. But it is actually pretty hard to determine whether a URL was actually removed by Twitter, as it is possible that the author of the tweet might have deleted it as well. To solve this issue, we created 3 private accounts which would regularly post tweets containing the malicious URLs from our dataset. We also checked how Twitter actually reacts to these posts. If a post was removed automatically or trying to visit the URL resulted in a warning, we considered the tweet as being detected. Throughout the duration of our study, we found that Twitter was able to detect about 38% of the phishing URLs in our dataset. Due to this dismal performance from Twitter's end, we are now very interested to examine how traditional anti-phishing engines performed against the URLs in our dataset. We divided our URLs into 2 categories. The ones which got detected by Twitter, let's call them type A, and the ones which did not get detected by Twitter, which we call type B. We actually found that type A URLs have 3 times the detection rate from anti-phishing tools when you compare them with type B URLs. Also, type A URLs were flagged by twice the number of unique anti-phishing engines compared to type B URLs. We also find that 80% of the anti-phishing tools have less than 10% detection rate for the type B URLs. Also, none of the anti-phishing tools were able to detect even half of the type B URLs. On the other hand, the engines actually performed far better for the type A URLs. So it appears that the URLs that were able to evade Twitter's detection were also able to avoid getting detected by several anti-phishing tools. To further confirm this assumption, we considered the 10 engines which had the best detection rate for the type A URLs, and we measured their performance against the type B URLs. The histogram on your right tracks the detection of each of these engines along the y-axis. We see that when dealing with the type B URLs, all the anti-phishing tools had a significant drop in their detection rates. Thus, type B URLs might just be characteristically different than the type A URLs. And this definitely warrants a closer look into the type B URLs. From our observation, we found that around 80% of the type B URLs were hosted over one of only 6 different website creation services. In comparison, only 7% of the type A URLs were hosted on the same services. We also found that on average, more than 50% of the websites hosted on these services were alive and accessible after a month of their appearance in our dataset. The table here shows the percentage of URLs hosted on each of these respective website service creation services which stayed alive after the first day and after a month. We also found that these phishing websites targeted one of 19 different organizations and they range from AT&T, Facebook, Chase Bank, Amazon, etc. Having characterized the features of the type B phishing URLs, we now turn our attention to the 264 URLs in our dataset which distributed drive-by downloads. Using the same method that we applied earlier to determine the phishing URLs, we found that Twitter was able to detect around 34% of these drive-by URLs throughout the duration of our study. We again examine how traditional anti-phishing engines performed against the drive-by download URLs in our dataset. We find that type A URLs actually have twice the detections from anti-phishing tools when compared to type B URLs. Similarly, type A URLs were also flagged by 1.5 times the number of unique anti-phishing engines compared to type B URLs. Also, 80% of the anti-phishing engines were able to detect less than 15% of the type B URLs. In fact, only 3 engines were able to detect half of the drive-by URLs of type B. Considering the detection rate of the 10 engines which performed the best against the type A drive-by download URLs, we compared them against the performance with the type B download URLs. Similar to the phishing URLs, we find that there's again a major dip in performance for the type B drive-by download URLs. While this drop is not as drastic as we had seen for the type B phishing URLs, it is still a major indication that anti-phishing engines struggle to detect these type B drive-by downloads. We find that around 82% of the type B URLs were hosted across 3 services. In comparison, only 3% of the type A URLs were hosted by the same services. Moreover, we found that these URLs were distributing malicious downloads, which contains threats from one of 9 different categories, and they included Trojan horses, spyware, ransomware, as you can see from this chart. A large majority of the type B URLs were also alive and accessible on their respective services even after a month. The table here shows the percentage of drive-by URLs hosted on each respective service which stayed alive after the first day and after a month. Now, both phishing and drive-by download attacks which use these website services show up consistently throughout the year in our dataset. After studying the characteristics of both categories of these malicious URLs, we hypothesize a few reasons why an attacker might prefer using these services rather than hosting their own website or domain. Firstly, based on our analysis, it can be concluded that URLs hosted under these services have a low chance of getting detected by both Twitter and the anti-phishing engines. This might be due to the anti-phishing tools whitelisting popular domains such as Google, Microsoft, WordPress, etc. We wish to actually perform a study in the future which can empirically prove if this is actually true. Likewise, URLs are also not often removed by these services themselves. This might provide an incentive to the attackers that their websites remain accessible for an extended period of time. Also, websites created under these services have up-to-date SSL certification, which again provides these websites with a sense of false authenticity. These websites are also free to create, and so attackers can use these services to quickly scale up the volume of their websites. Finally, the website creation process on these services are super easy and customizable. For example, we created a very convincing imitation of the PayPal login page on Weebly for free in just under 10 minutes. Another intriguing factor we have noticed before is that Twitter often generates a warning when visiting some of the detected websites instead of removing them outright. But we found that tweets which generated a warning can also be easily retweeted as well as shared as external links to other websites. We found around 63% of the phishing URLs that were detected by Twitter generated only a warning. Similarly, only 49% of the drive-by download URLs detected by Twitter also generated a warning. It is possible that attackers can share these URLs again and again, both on Twitter and on other external websites without any repercussions because Twitter is not removing several of these URLs. We again intend to explore the possibility and frequency of this actually happening on a larger scale on Twitter in a future study. Finally, we focus on the large chunk of benign URLs that VirusTotal detected as malicious. Now, actually, let's see how many of them get detected by Twitter. We observed that Twitter generated a warning for around 11% of these benign URLs. Digging deeper, we found that most of these URLs were using one of several different URL shortening services. The table shown here provides the data of how many URLs hosted in each shortening services generated a warning. In fact, we strongly suspect that Twitter detected these URLs based on the reputation of the URL shortening domain instead of the content of the website itself. We tried a small experiment by posting a non-existent URL shortened by Google's forms.gle URL shortener. Upon clicking on the URL, Twitter generated a warning like this. So it was still blocking the URL despite it not existing in any form. Now, prior work has indicated that Twitter detects these shortening services due to these services having hosted several malicious URLs in the past. But this proactive approach towards protection can also lead to several false positives. Fortunately, towards the end of our study, we find that Twitter has ceased to detect URLs from 4 of these URL shorteners, which is actually a good sign. To conclude our study, we evaluated and characterized over 1,200 malicious URLs that were posted on Twitter, and the majority of them remained undetected on the platform throughout the course of a year. We found that these websites were mostly hosted over 9 website creation services that were free to use and also very easy to use as well. To make matters worse, these services often did not remove several of these attacks for an extended period of time. Traditional anti-phishing tools also performed dismally against these threats. We found that even when they were detected by Twitter, they were not often removed and could be freely distributed across the platform or external websites. Finally, on the other side, Twitter detected several benign websites which used one of 7 different URL shortening services. Thank you for listening to my talk. I will be very happy to take your questions now, and you can also contact me at my email address given in the slide.